Okay. So, okay, let's start. Very welcome to everybody. This set event will have as a keynote speaker Federico Savini, who is an associate professor in environmental planning, institution and politics at the University of Amsterdam, where he works within the urban planning research group, if I'm correct. His research focuses on the governance of urban development and infrastructure, with particular attention to the ecological and social challenge posed to contemporary urbanization. And in recent years, he has also engaged a lot with the politics of degrowth and post-growth applied to urban planning, exploring how cities can transition toward a more sustainable, just, and democratic future. He combines theoretical insight with empirical research, often collaborating with activists, policymakers, and urban communities. I think that we invited Federico to close this semester of our set seminars because at least in our diverse groups among these three universities, we have seen a growing attention of cities as spaces for ecological justice transition. So I think that he touched on issues that are not new in this series of seminars, but very important for us also to close up because Federico, the previous two seminars that we had this semester were touching upon issues related to sustainability, but mainly from the individual level, not from the space of the city, the urban level. So I think that this will be a very important addition to our reflection, and I very well welcome you and also thank you for being here. We haven't met before, and we are really looking forward to listening to your talk and then opening the discussion. We usually have give to speaker 30 minutes, if it is okay with you, and then, or even a little bit more, I mean, between 30 and 45 minutes, and then we open the floor with questions and try to go a little bit deeper on issue that we think that are important. I also have already some topic that I would like to discuss with you. And so please go, the floor is yours, and we are here listening, ready to listen you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you, Alice, for contacting me and participating to this interesting series of meetings. So what I'm going to do today is to give you basically first an introduction of where this idea of degrowth and post-growth comes from and why it's important today. And after that, I will give you my own perspective on it, which obviously focuses on urbanization and urban growth. And I will conclude briefly, and I don't have a lot of time, but just giving you an indication of my work at the moment on the topic of social transformation and social change. That is what degrowth and post-growth advance. But let's start with clearing up some of the terms that sometimes are used by people in a way that is not really correct in my view, and often confusionary. So when we talk about degrowth or post-growth, we have to first understand that these ideas are emerging as a critique of what we know as green growth. Green growth is an approach to development that basically equates living standards, the increase of living standards, with increase of GDP, so monetary transactions, the gross domestic product of nations or regions, doesn't matter. And that assumes that GDP increase can actually be reconciled with climate targets through the use of technology. Moreover, green growth actually argues that we need more GDP in order to pay for green and to pay for ecological technologies. Now, the critique of green growth is generally called post-growth as an objective of many different disciplines. Okay, so post-growth economics or sociology or anthropology or geography, whatever you want, basically is an understanding that this GDP living standards equation is not true or is not that direct. And it is an envisioning of a society that actually can achieve collective well-being and ecological sustainability as well, independently from the growth of GDP, so of the growth of monetary relationships. Now, this is a very broad concept, and that's why it's also very inclusive. Many groups, political groups and scholars, they can kind of agree with this. However, the degrowth argument is a step further. Basically, degrowth recognizes the post-growth perspective clearly, but is more explicit about the need to reduce and downscale current GDP in affluent societies, so societies that have too much. And to do so, they understand that it's not a technical problem, but is a political one that actually tackles the existing relationships of production and exploitation within capitalism. So degrowth is much more radical as a view of transition towards a post-growth economy. Now, the reason why these things are becoming important these days is that, in fact, we are increasingly aware of the failure of mainstream sustainability programs. On the left, you see the relationship between the GDP increase, the orange line, and the CO2 emissions, which is the dotted line. You see that the CO2 emissions are not decreasing in any way close to what we should actually achieve. Not we, but that governments recognized as something to be achieved. But you also see the pink line or violet line. That line shows also that there is no decrease whatsoever in the material stuff, in the materials that are extracted from the planet every day. So we see a material reflection of economic growth, being that green or brown or blue, whatever you want. On the right, you see the same figure, but focusing on the mainstream politics of sustainability. And this is a figure, used by scientists for futures everywhere, and it kind of shows that many of the theatrical politics of sustainability, they achieve little to nothing in terms of climate target, let alone social targets. Now, another tenet of post-growth and degrowth economics is the argument that even if green growth cannot be decoupled from environmental damage, maybe some economists might argue that more growth at least make people happier. But also there, the developmental argument is being disproven recently by many economists that study life satisfaction and social progress. That they show, in fact, that it is true that some increase in production and consumption obviously increases happiness and life satisfaction and social progress up to a certain point, after which we see a flattening curve where basically we see very affluent, very rich countries having a relatively dissatisfied population. The left image is quite known, as shows the relationship between GDP and happiness by country. We have countries like the US having the same degree of happiness like countries like Costa Rica, which completely different, obviously, degrees of wealth. But on the right image, you see a more detailed, for example, picture of how also within specific regions of the world, you see that there is a different perception of increase of wealth relative to income. For example, in Latin America, the green line with the LA, it's interesting to see that, in fact, the satisfaction, the life evaluation by people gets reached by $40,000 per year income. But after that, we see that the affluent groups tend to actually perceive their life as worse than before. Now, the argument clearly is here that increasing quantity does not mean increasing quality. Okay. Now, an important tenet of the post-growth critique is that the green growth approach not only doesn't work in terms of sustainability targets, but also in terms of social equality and social targets. Basically, the argument is that the social the environmental justice issue is a social justice issue. Now, we rather are aware of the global picture that, you know, the top most affluent countries, about 10% of the population of the world, consumes about 60% or emits about 60% of all the emissions globally, which is equal to the whole emissions of the bottom 50%. And this is a typical argument of those that focus on global north, global south inequality. However, what I like more is pictures that show that this inequality is also the same. It also happens within regions, within the global south and within the global north. For example, in Europe, you see that the top 10% incomes consume or emit 6 times more the bottom 50%. If you see in North America, this is also even more accentuated. What also you see is that, for example, in the Middle East, North Africa, which is on the bottom, on the second spot, you see that in fact you see the petrol state syndrome, right? Where you have extremely wealthy capitalist sovereign class multinationals of oil that owned by shareholders that emit basically more than 10 times the bottom 50% of the population. What you also see here, indeed, is the problem of affluence. You see that, you know, in continents like North America, in Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, we have a problem of too many emissions across the board, also within the poorer social groups, obviously for different reasons. But we also see that there are countries and continents where it's definitely not a problem to have CO2 emissions. They are not emitting that much. This picture basically has been summarized quite well by this author, Matt Hulber, that indeed points out that after all, the inequality is what drives environmental breakdown, and we need to recognize that. This other picture is the same, but it shows the trend in history, and we see that in the left picture, you see in the last 30 years, we see a shift of wealth from the public, from the middle classes and the poorer social classes to the top 10 and 1% of the world. You know, if you know that in the last 5 years, the top 5 billionaires of the world have doubled their wealth. So in the middle of a pandemic, the top rich of the world have doubled their wealth. This increase in inequality is extreme, and in fact, it is clear that, you know, as the Gilets jaunes in France have said time ago, the end of the world and the end of the month are the same struggle. It's a matter of also who drives this environmental breakdown. Now, degrowth, as I said, is really clear about the need to downscale production and consumption and the political need, let's say, challenge to do so. The definition of degrowth is basically a planned downscaling of all activities that are environmentally harmful and socially alienating, starting from those that are less necessary for the well-being of humans and the environment. And the key word here is less necessary. So it's about decreasing unnecessary productions and consumptions. But also, degrowth is very explicit about the need to increase all activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve societal well-being. And here, importantly, starting from the fulfilling of basic needs, or what we can call universal basic needs. So food, shelter, for example, a certain degree of accessibility. So degrowth is not an agenda of overall reduction, but it's indeed an agenda of a politics of more for many people and few and less for many few. Like George Monbiot put it nicely, it's a project of private sufficiency and public luxury. I like that term, you know. Now, to achieve that agenda, in my work, I focus on urbanization. Now, the reasons are many, but in a nutshell, the reason why I look at urbanization is that urbanization is the core, let's say, is the headquarter. Cities are the headquarter of green growth today. They are, first of all, relatively small in relative to the overall planet surface, but they are the reason why we consume about 75% of all materials. By the way, if we include, obviously, the land used by agriculture, which is much larger than cities, and we look where the amount of food is consumed the most and wasted the most, obviously, again, here we come to cities. Moreover, if you look at some particular cities in the planet, about 600 cities cover almost 2/3 of the global economic wealth. So there are few urban centers that drive the economy globally as we know it today. And finally, if we want to look at urbanization as a process of ecological destruction, we know that in fact the production of the built environment after energy is the most destructive of all. Now, obviously, as I said before, urbanization is something that is also necessary in countries of what we understand as late urbanization. It is also necessary to provide homes where they are needed. The question is how to reduce excess consumption and production in order to create the space for those necessary consumptions and productions. Now, the current sustainability, mainstream sustainability, okay, first of all, I don't have to just go one step back. I don't have to actually justify why non-green growth or like fossil-based capitalism is bad. I will not discuss this, but I will discuss why the mainstream approach to green growth, so sustainable growth in cities, are bad, because we need to also detach politics from those, I would suggest. First of all, they are bad because the success of the green transition within urban centers is made on the shoulders of what Nikos Katsikis and Neil Brenner call the operational landscapes of urbanization, or others call the sacrificed labor and sacrificed zones of economic growth. These are basically the peripheries, the imperial peripheries of our economic system, where in fact materials for the green economy are extracted and where productions are located. On the right, you see production of food in the periphery of China. On the left, you see labor conditions, the extraction of cobalt for the green electric economy. The second related problem to it is that this growth is not simply, unsustainable, but it's really consuming land globally. Consuming land that eventually turns out to be destructive of the ecosystem in which we live. From deforestation to mines of lithium like the one you see there. Now, what is interesting here is that the production now, it's a fraction, it's very small of what we will need to fuel the economy if we want to even sustain current standards of consumption and production. Lithium is expected to increase by 4 times in 2040. This is a huge projection. We know now that indeed lithium is extremely scarce. The raw materials for solar energy alone in the EU will be 3 times more demanded in the next 5 years. Actually, if we look at who produces these materials on the left, you can see that the economy of the EU is actually, or all the economies are increasingly dependent on producers such as Australia, like China, first of all, and then Australia and Chile, but also China and Congo and Russia. These are the places where the critical material for the green transitions are extracted. The image on the right is a bit less clear, but what you see there is, in fact, even if hypothetically we would be able to extend solar power to fuel the current economy, most of the countries in the EU will not have available land to do so. This means that they will have to look for land elsewhere, to grab land, and this process will and is actually already triggering new forms of colonialism and conflicts. Okay, what's happening in the conflict areas is not only identitarian conflicts, it's actually conflicts for material resources and for land. The third problem of sustainable urbanization is basically the creation of inequality even within cities themselves, not only outside, but also within them. Processes that have been defined as low carbon gentrification or green gentrification basically a situation in which the investments for sustainability basically get targeted exclusively to areas of wealthy social groups, or areas where it's possible to actually capitalize on those investments in the increase of real estate prices. These are just examples. The left is one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the center of Amsterdam, and it's the one who did the fastest transition to pedestrianization. You find there the bars for the cafes selling avocado salads and all these things. It is great and very touristic, but it is very unaffordable. Okay, so it is becoming more and more. I mean, it is basically an island for the happy few. Now, so if we take these critiques together, I think we can translate the idea of degrowth for urbanization in this way. First of all, degrowth is a process of indeed downscaling and slowing down the material demand of urbanization, what we call the social metabolism of the urban. This is done through a politics that pursues well-being in areas where it's needed to increase, obviously, directly and not as a function of economic growth. This obviously it's done through increasing life quality where it is needed, but also reducing excess consumption and excess wealth. And if you look in practice at cities and how this happens, because this sometimes happens, we see that the way to do so, it's in investing in what we can understand as human space intense immaterial economies. So these are economies of healthcare, education, and culture, where many people are busy and employed, where direct services, essential services are provided, and where the space for the economy itself, it's smaller. Just to give you an idea, you can compare my university campus. There are about 25,000 people coming in every day between students and staff within a 3 hectares campus, 4 hectare campus, so not that big. If you just go outside of Amsterdam, you have a 40 hectares distribution center where the employment is about altogether 1,000 people. Okay, so you can see that you have this massive extension of land through an economy that it's based on logistics, so the transfer of goods and material stuff rather than services. So this has been already quite interesting for urban policymakers. Now, until now, I talked about cities, but I would like just to give also for people who are from disciplines different than mine, to give you an idea of how many potential research questions and research practices there are when somebody takes degrowth and post-growth as a point of study, as a matter of study. In this table, I would not go through it completely, but in this table, you just see the many disciplinary approaches to degrowth. For example, the second one is very interesting. It's research on consumer culture, consumerism, and the psychosocial dimension of consumption. And a post-growth or a degrowth proposition would focus on desires and pleasures that are not material, and study of indeed non-material practices of conviviality, of finding happiness and satisfaction together. Obviously, this research can go very well together with study on the economics of care, which is typical of the feminist political ecology or the feminist critique to capitalism, which questions the obsession with production and the devaluation of social reproduction work, which is done by women and people, like marginalized groups at all levels of scales. There is also an interesting field that looks, for example, at the role of technologies in degrowth. And there they question the nature of the infrastructure from, let's say, a monopolistic or oligopolistic enclosed infrastructure, like, for example, OpenAI today, or just Elon Musk, if I want to say that, to an infrastructure that is diffuse and it's convivial, but again, not necessarily low tech. Okay, so it's the discussion there is already advanced. It's not about low tech. It's about different types of open source, open access infrastructure. Yeah, then we have studies on the global north, global south, unequal exchange. They look at the indigenous culture, the way they take care of the environment, and look and develop their views of progress. So we have different, again, critiques, including obviously the Marxist critique on the role of workers and de-alienation and the importance of the commons and the socialization of the means of production in this process of undoing growth. So anyway, there are plenty of people working on degrowth from different angles. That's my point here, and I think there is a lot of interesting hooks for students and researchers from this critique. Now, this is a detailed understanding. Usually here at this point, I give a more detailed analysis of how cities grow, because in fact, it is important to understand the mechanics of urban growth in order to also envision a possible way to transition to a post-growth urbanization. And to analyze those mechanics, I wrote this contribution in a handbook of degrowth that is coming out now in a month, edited by Anitra Nelson. And there basically I explain this figure. But going, like if I have time, I would just 5 minutes give you an idea a bit of what it means. To connect the transformation in this picture, I connect the transformation of the built environment to socioeconomic dynamics and to ecological dynamics. This is the inner circle, the middle circle, the outer circle. If you start from the right on economic innovation, so the inner circle on the right, you see that economic innovation has become the obsession for national and regional and urban policymakers. By pursuing economic innovation, they create obsolete urban fabrics. You basically at one point, you want to accommodate a new economy in the city, and the spaces you have, the infrastructure you have is not suitable anymore. Think about the creative class instead of the working class. You have to transform a lot of spaces, right, in the city. To do that, you need investments. Investments are fueled by debt through different forms. I'm not going to go into details. This debt always demand more urban renewal to repay the debt. So obviously, and this renewal creates always displacement. This displacement, people who are displaced need houses and eventually end up looking for new homes. And this looking for new homes generate urban expansion, especially when the city wants to be compact, so prices go up. People go outside of the city to find their house. When they go outside of the city, urban expansion demands more consumption. Consumption here is understood both as urbanization through selling homes and buying new appliances, but also as public investments in infrastructures like highways or trains. When you have public investments in infrastructure, obviously the governments and the private investors in infrastructure are always interested in doing them more efficiently and more ecologically, especially when they get targets of sustainability to be imposed by them. And this drives more economic innovation. Okay, so this is and so on. So this is the cycle that never ends. Now, this process obviously needs resources to the city to build up this process, increases the ecological footprint overall of the regions globally, and of course produces waste. Now, you have a degree of circular interventions that can reuse that waste in order to feedback on this process. But as I showed in many of my publications, and I'm not the only one, this feedback, it's always never complete, because obviously you cannot reuse all the waste, and you always need input of energy and materials to reuse or upcycle stuff. Okay, we can talk about circular economy later if you have questions about that. Now, my point of this is that this is a cycle that, on the one hand, has many entry points of critique, from debt to displacement. So you can take it from wherever you want. I could start the same story from displacement, whatever, but also has a lot of possible solutions. So you can also think about different interventions that kind of address any of these steps. Okay. By the way, I want to say that unfortunately, national governments know that there are many ways to accelerate this cycle. For example, large-scale events like Olympic Games, they usually accelerate this. Another way to accelerate is through suburbanization, like what's happening in China with, what we call leapfrog development. They put a station in the middle of, an old village. They displace the people there. This station leads in investments in housing, and they create a new urban center. That's how urbanization in China works and has been studied. But also there are many other ways. For example, distraction through wars is also another way governments, unfortunately, for cynic reasons, produce obsolete urban fabric that needs to be rebuilt. You can simply just imagine how many investments there will be in Gaza as soon as that area gets displaced completely. And this is an economic dimension of that conflict, unfortunately. This is just like many ways you can look at this circle. In my work, and this is cited here, I also try to give an alternative view on this process. I summarize the key tenets of this process in these 3 words. First of all, the building of autonomy within regional spaces. Autonomy in this sense, it's understood as a political and material process. Basically, the argument is that as far as cities are, city regions and nation states are dependent on other lands and countries far away, they will also always not have the political power to disrupt this system. Okay, so the role of autonomy here is very important. Finity is also a way to look at regulations, planning regulations, addressing this circle. And there I understand finity as basically a politics that guarantees minimum and maximum standard of living. Minimum because we need to be sure that every single area in the region has enough environmental and essential social services, but also maximum because thinking in terms of reduction of excess requires the regulation of unleashed and development and extreme wealth. And finally, these 2 are probably not happening unless we change the frame of looking at human settlement as such. And here we need a post-human perspective on the habitats in which urban environments exist or coexist. This means also reestablishing frameworks of co-production between urban spaces and non-urban spaces, like rural natural areas. Now, this is really a shift of the mentality in mainstream planning and urban economics. And many of these things I'm just saying have been already written around, and in particular, the bioregionalism, the bioregional perspective, I think already kind of developed these 3 principles quite well. There is some material there to look at. And it's a long tradition, it's a libertarian socialist tradition of urban affairs that in fact has a lot of these critiques already in it. There I was giving a few examples of what I mean. Of course, protecting agri-commons of the city, that's some struggles in Amsterdam we have in order to protect the leftover biodiverse areas within the city that are threatened by, in this case, airport expansion. On the bottom right, you see the same plan that tries to integrate food producing spots within a neighborhood. So it's a small scale, not even at the regional scale, even though it can be done at all scales. You see, of course, movements on the top right, like in Berlin, movement claiming that there is too much home ownership in some cases, like the expropriation of companies that have more than 2,000 dwellings, because it's just simply unethical to have so many dwellings. And on the left, you see, for example, the building of more of housing cooperatives as a project that tries to indeed cap or block the commodification of housing, keeping it affordable, and creating a degree of autonomy, in this sense, housing autonomy, within a specific cluster of people. And it doesn't have to be that big, can be also smaller or larger. This is an example of a very large cooperative in Zurich. Anyway, these are examples of how we can see the city from a post-growth lens. Now, to conclude my talk, I would like to give you just an hint of the work I'm doing now, together with other my PhDs here in Amsterdam, because I gave you a nice, I hope I gave you a nice idea of what a post-growth perspective could be. But we have to be aware that while this might be a nice idea on paper, there is no consent, there is no public support for these ideas in times of post-fascism and hyper-capitalism and neo-colonialism and militarization, to put it this way. We are going all the way on another direction if we look at politically. So the most important reflection that degrowth and we should have is a strategic reflection. It's a strategy of how we build the capacity, the political capacity to actually advance that agenda. And to do that, we have to conceptualize strategic planning for degrowth. And I did that in this paper, which it's much longer than this single slide. This is the only slide I will have on this, but I hope you will read the paper. I don't have time to go into depth. But in this paper, I give you an idea of what are somehow the inputs that degrowth literature has in terms of strategic thinking. And I think one of the most interesting is the distinction between these three processes that somehow drive social ideological change. First of all, by the way, this distinction is built on a work by a scholar, a cultural scholar from Maastricht called Miriam Meisner. You can check the paper called Cultural Politics of Degrowth. You will find it online. There, she defines these three moments or three processes of cultural change. The first is what we understand as prefiguration, which is in fact the practice of the art of practicing, let's say, the future in the present. These are all kind of projects of degrowth that we already see, the real life existing practices of degrowth, from urban gardens to, sharing, housing cooperatives, low tech, open access. I mean, all kind of stuff that you can find in cities today, where people basically find a way to provide essential services and question excess. Well, this is everywhere. However, it's not enough. Focusing on prefiguration alone would be a mistake, would be, I would say, folkloristic and in fact not effective. So it is important to also understand how these practices change the mindset of people broadly, or become a bit common sense. And this is the process of popularization. So when within the masses we have somehow a recognition that these prefigurative practices or what they do is good, okay, is appreciated, is desirable. And finally, we have a process of claiming that those practices have to, they need a different institutional environment to thrive. And this is done through movements of pressure. So we need to recognize, very importantly, the role of social movements in this process. Now, I would like to say here that the way prefiguration becomes popularization and shift and sustain pressure doesn't happen automatically. So the big mistake of movements and governments today is that these things happen automatically on their own. It's not true, because we have broad movements of social ecological movements on the street which do not turn into new institutions. They often become marginalized, okay, and somehow trigger regressive and reactionary politics. We also have plenty of prefigurative practices that do not have explicit demands, okay, to government. So these three things don't happen in a vacuum. We need a planned strategy that connects this and thinking in terms of organization and tactics, able to actually create the synergy between these three moments of cultural change, okay? And here I usually read a lot of literature on political parties, for example, the role of political parties, the role of national organizations, the bridge between movements and practices. So we have to think in those terms. So this was my pitch, let's put it this way. I hope I didn't take too much time. And if you want more, of course, and more information and literature, I usually put everything I find in this website, and together with many other people, obviously, busy with me on this. And well, thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions.
That's what it was wonderful, Federico. Thank you very much. Also, because this final slide is really what have given us the idea to invite you. So since we weren't agreed about showing this post-growth coalition, that it's really something that because I completely with you when you say that this doesn't come alone. You need organization and you need tactics, and this is mainly what we are trying to do with our research group in Trento with this round multi-stakeholder table that we are trying to design. I mean, to help grassroots organization to not just prefigurate what the world they want to live, the society they want to live, but also to pressure the government, the local government, in order to achieve that for all. Because all the practices that you have mentioned have a little bit of problem that are middle classes mainly acted prefiguration practices. So that was our concern when we started actually to think about how can we help these social experiment that we value so much to scaling through institution, because and that's really a big struggle. But I might have some question around this issue, also coming from our own experience. But I will open the floor now, and because I have lots of questions, but I would like to see if other people have them. But thank you very much. It was a very good overview. At the beginning, I say that we haven't touched Degrowth so explicitly so far, but for example, many of our previous webinar, because we are scholar coming from social movement studies or critical consumption studies, we have, for example, had several webinar on consumption and production corridors. So they need to help people that has less to have more, but also to try to keep a border, a limit on the wealth of wealthy people that are actually who are creating the major environmental troubles. But anyway, question from all of some of you. Don't know. We always need some minutes to digest. Okay, there is Alice with a little baby, new member of our group.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Okay. So thank you, Federico. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for this interesting presentation. I have a question that really kind of emerges from my latest interests in digitalization and the platform economy. So we have been also together with Francesca kind of been thinking critically about this narrative of the twin transitions, so of sustainability and digital transition as twin transitions that help cities to become more sustainable. And in part, we did this work also kind of criticizing the idea of growth. But yeah, what I wanted to ask you is, do you see a space for platforms or digitalization and the platform economy to contribute to degrowth in cities, or do you only see the contradiction there?
So yeah, a very, very nice question. First of all, let me put it this way. If by platform economy, you mean the current platform economy, then no, I think this is the end of the world as we see it now. Simply not because it's a platform, but it's simply because the economic structure is monopolistic and it will not lead to democracy or any way open possibilities for rethinking our economy. Quite the contrary. However, the question of platform economy, the internet, it was quite well addressed by many scholars already in the 90s. People like Tony Negri, you know, and friends, they were really carefully explaining how the new conditions of biopolitical production and the planetary commons made possible through the internet were not only a capitalist a machine of capital accumulation being appropriated by the platform capitalists, but it was also a process of it could have opened up processes of emancipation and liberation. That was the argument, right, by these people that theorized production and consumption in those years of the building of the internet. They were very hopeful. Now, they were wrong, clearly. We see on the one hand the consolidation of this economy as a really a big backbone of contemporary capitalism. On the other hand, partially they were also right, because what we see is the ideas, even ideas such as degrowth, they circulate much more easily through those means. So I have a very I think the economy through the platform economy, the good one, can enable the circulation of ideas. Also, we should not underestimate the role of the platform economy and social media for this process of popularization that I explained. So things become popular when they get appealing, desirable, or seductive, right? This is a typical way, when we take Gramsci seriously, this is the way we can look at societal transition. So societal transition happens when certain practices and movements become desirable within people that do not in principle agree with them. And this is done also through, indeed, influencers. I mean, we need a degrow influencers. We need those people that somehow shift the range of desirable beyond the material consumerism. So we need also movies that give us an alternative. For example, the way we portrayed alternatives to capitalism in cinema or even brief videos often is so depressing and so destructive. And this depressing and destructive is exactly what capitalism wants within a capitalism realism process. They do not give you the hope that it's needed or the alternative that is needed for triggering social movements. This stuff is written everywhere. I mean, I can talk hours for it about it. I mean, the movement of the 68 by the students and the workers were inspired by the Vietnam, the resistance against the imperialism in Vietnam, because they understood that it was possible to fight against, American imperialism, and therefore students saw the hope there into these situations. This is what triggered those protests. It's written. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a lot about this, in fact. So I find the study of content within the platform economy very important within post-growth studies. If I can summarize, my answer.
Sara?
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Federico. It was very interesting listening to you. I am very new in degrowth studies, but I'm recently thinking about I'm recently working on waste management in global north, and how north-south interaction in related to waste can be a kind of entry point to degrowth in the global north. And my main interest now is about municipal waste, solid waste. In terms, from the urban planning, I was wondering, do you think if there is any possibility that how we manage our waste in our cities can help us to think about degrowth when it comes to production-consumption relationship? I'm very curious to hear about if you have any thought about it, or if there is not a shortcut, but at least some light that we can look at degrowth from that perspective, because at the same time we can control consumption and also even production, but open a field that, okay, degrowth can happen towards, can happen, can take place, find some rooms for itself through waste management. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. I myself also came into post-growth and degrowth studying indeed, or developing a critique of the circular economy in relation to waste. So this is for me a very natural way. And why it is a very natural way is because when we look at how our economy works, there are two reasons why it's still in place. One is that the production work, the destruction of environment through production is made invisible within many cities. So we don't know how masses of animals are basically the animal genocide that we are producing today is away from the eyes of the masses that consume food, right? The torture of animals, or the torture of the environment, and the torture of the workers that dig stuff for the affluent societies is invisible. Okay, this is one reason. But the other thing is that the contradiction of production through waste is also invisible. So we do not have in front of our eyes the direct immediate impact of our consumption. So for me, waste is somehow the link between production and consumption that allows to also link it at the level of the individual as well. So not only at the level of economic production system, obviously, but also at the level of individual. So in my view, looking at waste does, or making waste visible, first of all, does create that immediate awareness or the immediate feel of the problem of growth. In fact, it has been studied, like people like Matthew Gandhi, their work on urban political ecology, it's rooted in the study of waste. In his early works, he clearly explained how capitalist urbanization emerged through this paradigm of hygiene that kind of allowed to displace waste from the city and allowed to open up and accelerate capitalist urbanization. So for him, this was a key process to unlock capitalist urbanization. So I think the waste is basically the key to many of the things. And I think also, if you look at it from the point of view of appropriation of the productive process, it's not only about occupying factories, that happens less and less, I have to say, in many countries, but it's also about appropriating the residuals of production and use them for social purposes. That's where we see many degrowth practices already happening, basically the grassroots circularity practices. People basically take leftover food, use it for giving it to people who don't have money, people who have common kitchens, people who repair stuff. This is post-capitalism in real life. I mean, repairing your own phone is the most anti-capitalist thing you can do today, apart from going on the street and protesting. because you're actually taking ownership of one of the essential means of life, which is your phone. The same would be for data, making and repairing your own data system and algorithms. It would be the same. But anyway, so I hope I made clear how I think waste is really everywhere in this critique. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
Thank
By
you.
the way, corporate social responsibility for waste would be also a very easy measure to do in the affluent societies in order to regulate prices on useless stuff that we buy. Yeah.
Since I see that there are not other hands, one reason that suggests us to invite you is also because at least what we have seen from the internet, you are also working together with municipality or activists. I mean, you are not a scholar that just writes article. As far as we understood from the net, that is not always true, but
It's
at
true.
least
It's true.
this is the idea that we came into our mind. So the question is for me to you is what is the role that today can play the university? What is the role that we can play in this? Because I mean you have mentioned the grassroots. I've been working on this type of grassroots movement that we label as sustainable community movement organization almost 20 years ago. And I've been looking at them, studying them, and it seems to me that are there, is true, but they are not growing, because you mentioned before the 68 student movement. I mean, there was a lot of hope there because anyway, there was a future ahead. Now we are living in a regression time, no? So it is really much more difficult. I mean, social movement theory has written lots about that. This is much more difficult to mobilize when opportunities are closed, because people don't see the hope, and they try to close down. So there are people that are mobilizing, but they are, in my opinion, more or less always the same. I mean, they have stayed more or less stable. I have looked and analyzed, for example, this phenomena of solidarity purchasing group. We counted also how many hair they had in their head. So I know perfectly their profile, the socioeconomic profile, and all that. And I know that they are stable, they are there, they are not visible anymore as well as they were 10 years ago. But anyway, they are there. They may be a solidarity purchasing group as their kind of lifestyle. So there are people there, but there are middle classes people, and there are people that usually, for example, in Italy, they were or either from Catholic background or for leftist background. But these ideology have lost power and to make sense to life of people. So my question is this: how can we make degrowth something desirable from people, by normal people, not us? For us is desirable. I mean, we are writing, but we are also practicing degrowth. I mean, if I see all the people that are here in this Zoom room. And on the other side, my question was, what can we do as academics, and if you can give us some idea of what the work you are doing, that in my opinion is academic work. I mean, but of course it goes outside. You know, in some university they call it outreach. So how you outreach your theoretical reasoning, your theoretical work into society, and I mean, and what do you think that we should do? I mean, what could be our role in all this? Because I think, for example, in the degrowth movement, there are a lot of academics.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Academics are notably people who tend to engage with movements, especially in the social and human sciences. I mean, they've been always there somehow. And you say that we all practice degrowth. I'm not sure about that. So having prefiguration is not necessarily practicing degrowth. Sometimes satisfying some essential needs that you have, maybe of being solidary with people, being mutualistic and feeling good about what you do, but it's not necessarily practicing degrowth as a process of post-capitalist transition. Practicing degrowth as a process of post-capitalist transition would mean to engage actively in movements of pressure. That would be in the three things, would extend to popularization, and then I'm going to tell you how I do it personally, and move towards pressure. So practicing prefiguration is not necessarily practicing degrowth as a transition. It's doing something nice, good, fine, but not enough, in my view, to call it as practicing degrowth. Now, how do we engage in movements of pressure and popularization? With regards to pressure, it is pretty clear that the battle of pressure is in the analysis of a post-capitalist transition happens in two fields of action. One is the field of production, and two is the field of ideological production. In that case, it is both production. For production, it means that we need to recognize ourselves as workers that produce something. And within the university, we produce knowledge. That's what we do. We produce knowledge and we are not self-employed. We are dependent on an institution that pays us often, if we're lucky, let's say, to have a contract. So we are workers of knowledge production. If we are workers of knowledge production, we need to use our leverage there and change the way knowledge production is produced, which means critique the absurd, I would say, productivist logic that we have in our university. Starting from the way we produce papers, we publish them, we sell them to our publishing houses, from the way we sell our free labor to our institution that does tons of meetings about bullshit green stuff, and then we spend hours on it, to how we teach our students, so the way we relate to them. This is and the demands that we give together with students to the university. So this is work of labor contestation as workers. So this is the first thing I would imagine, the university as a space of workers contestation, and we are workers in that sense. I don't even own my own laptop, when I work, so it's it's clearly a situation where I could be considered a worker. Now, you pointed the issue of middle class. I agree. Many of the people involved in social justice movement are middle class people. But first of all, I understand this. People can afford to do that are people who have their own material needs covered, and that's not a problem. It's been like that. It's been like that always. Karl Marx was the first upper aristocrat that kind of used his life to advocate for workers. So it's not a problem per se. But the question is, right, and also, by the way, degrowth as a project of the reduction in affluent societies, it's also a project that needs to engage with the desires and dissatisfactions of the middle classes. Okay, also because it's a large majority of the population within affluent countries. However, this has to be done in a way that is, of course, clearly focused on the satisfaction of material needs for everybody. So we should not focus on the satisfaction of immaterial needs only, but also as a middle class, focus on the satisfaction of immediate material needs. So we need to advocate for social housing, we need to advocate for a fair pay, and we need to advocate for a shorter working week and for universal basic incomes and all of this. So these are middle classes advocating for labor policies. And that's the difficult challenge. How do we make it popular? I really don't know. Scientists are very bad in making things popular because we're not trained for that. We don't have the means often to do that. So one way would be to engage with content creators, people who deal with the masses, movie makers, whatever, people who do advertisement, critical advertisement or guerrilla advertisement. engaging with these people, communicating what degrowth or post-growth means, what is the analysis behind it, and helping them translating this into a new imaginary. Okay, the production of new imaginaries is something that scholars are not that good at doing, but we should also cut some slack to scholars because we can't do everything, right? So, but we have to conversate with them. That's what I try to do. I try as much as I can to conversate with social movements and groups that are asking themselves, what is my narrative? What is my narrative for winning my struggle? And I try to give them the tools to construct a narrative. And in this audience, there are many social groups, from socialist groups to indeed middle-class groups or for colleagues, students, and some politicians. I try to not give talks to companies that are clearly too far out and away. That would be a waste of my time, unfortunately, but it's just because I have only 7 days in a week. So that's how I deal with this question. But about the university politics is very interesting because what's happening there when I tell about we should contest the system of knowledge production in the university, how we publish, blah blah blah. Always comes somebody obviously that fairly says, but wait a second, people need a job, young scholar, assistant professor, postdoc, PhDs, they need to publish, they need a job, they need this to get a permanent position, they are precarious. And I agree. The problem is not the postdocs and the assistant professor. Often the problem is the upper tiers of our universities, where this culture of productivism has been fully integrated, where we have very successful scholars who have nothing to lose. They have huge salaries, nothing to lose. They could publish half of what they do, but they don't. They internalize completely the competition. And so the critique needs to be contextualized in the means that people have. So I understand how postdocs need to publish. They do need. But the question is why this kind of critique doesn't come from the let's say the hub, from the top of the hierarchy within university politics. That's the problem. I don't know if in your university let's say your university top tier scholars are all enlightened and they are very clear about this, but it's not the case in my university.
Francesca, may I add something?
Yes.
I think it is very, I don't know, but I see it very similar to the balance. When we talk about degrowth, of course, we don't talk about degrowth for global south. They have to have their own growth. But the global north should limit itself. It is like when we compare professors and postdocs. Of course, professors should limit themselves, but young scholars they have a space to develop and to have some kind of growth, as we call it. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yes, it is true. The problem is sometimes to older professor needs power in order to open up opportunity for younger scholar. And that's the problem. We are all in the same game, because if you don't have power, you are not able to open up. And power is measured with all these, I don't know, it's really complex, because it's true, it should come from the top, and we should question why on the top they are so addicted to this system, because it is a way for them to maintain the power. And
well, I don't know, I can talk hours about this, but there is a colleague of mine works in The Hague. In that university, they have a system, they have a list where they have completely artificial rankings of publishers and journals based on Google clicks, and based on these rankings they assess whether you actually can get more or less teaching as a young scholar. They assess whether you get a promotion. It's complete bullshit, and it's made by committees of professors and administrators sitting in a room and deciding this in order to basically discipline their hierarchy. It's it's completely not necessary. We don't have it in my university. We don't have this. We work very well. I mean, these institutional barriers, and there are plenty, they stay there, and often are conceptualized indeed as a way to sustain hierarchy, not to enable.
Okay. Definitely.
So yeah, we need to be critical as workers within the university. We need to be critical how the system works, very much, and also unionize. I mean, we're not unionized, and now, for example, the Dutch government is cutting €1 billion from the university, and the unions are struggling just to bring us on the street. So there are all kind of things we can do, but yeah, I understand it's a system to be unlocked, and there are codependencies, but we need to start somewhere.
And it's very difficult unless we don't create alliances little by little, and also be conscious of this, what you said, that we need to pressure, because many of these prefigurative movements have grown up with their ambition to be autonomous. And instead, I mean, because, for example, in Italy, it was very clear they were very anti-political, but in the sense that they didn't want to have anything to do with the state. But the state is important. I mean, you have to build alternatives, but you have also to pressure, because this alternative would be, otherwise we won't be available for all. So it is very difficult to accompany this kind of, as you said, I mean, to make this pressure relevant also for this new cycle of movement that were more kind of building alternative rather than pressuring institutions to allow alternative way of living.
Yeah, I think within Degrowth, if I understand correctly, what you're raising is also a very important debate within Degrowth politics, especially as the usual debate between more anarchist and more socialist views of transition. There is an excessive focus within the anarchists on prefiguration, so you need to practice horizontal politics and then eventually build a consent, while there are many socialists that say we need, a more, organized structure, perhaps a party or a vanguard that helps to indeed popularize degrowth. There are these debates constantly within the left, and they're very interesting, but as again, Sartre said very clearly, I like Sartre very much, you probably understood that. He said that indeed the form of organization depends on the particular conditions in which you operate. So if we look at how the conditions in which we operate now as radical movements, we are in a situation where mass mobilization from the grassroots up has failed. We have an increased repression. We have a nationalist turn into national politics with a state that is oppressive. So in these conditions, maybe, grassroots organizations are not enough. We need maybe indeed a party that uses the means of this politics against conservative politics. So this is the type of discussion maybe that we need to have, depending on the historical space and the country in which we are.
Yes, but if you think that now the turnout is very low, I mean, we are really trapped in a very difficult situation. How to overcome it is much more difficult than 20 years ago, I believe.
Yeah. Yes, it's very difficult. Exactly. That's why we need to analyze the political situation of the moment. And now it's different than 5 years ago when degrowth became popular. It's different.
Definitely.
So this is the analysis the social movements are doing, by the way, now. I mean, they are aware.
Any other comment? Curiosity? Question?
Maybe it's time to
Yes, to
call it
close.
call it a day.
Well, it was very nice, Federico. Really, I think that all of us enjoyed very much and learned as well. And it is a very good material as well to a very good introduction also to Degrowth that our student can watch next year, next academic year. So you gave a big present today, and hope to catch up and to see you again in other opportunity occasion. And well, what to say? Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.